Welcome back, everybody, to another video today, and we are going to take a look at another one of the American Battlefield Trust's fantastic animated battle maps. If you're ever looking to get a crash course on a particular battle or a particular historic subject in a short time, I highly recommend American Battlefield Trust. They're also an organization whose mission is to preserve land of historic significance in the United States of America. They raise money and buy up land so it doesn't get gobbled up by developers and things like that, so they can preserve even some of the lesser known battlefields that people don't really know a lot about. So I highly recommend that you check out their channel, watch their videos. There's a lot to be learned from there. I just want to use their video on the Battle of Shiloh today as a jumping off point for us to have a discussion about the Battle of Shiloh. In addition, I'll put a link in the description below to my visit to the Shiloh battlefield about a year and a half ago, and you can see some of these sites they're talking about firsthand. I did a couple hour tour of the battlefield, just kind of walked around, tried to hit some of the key points, so that link's in the description. But let's go ahead and dive into the American Battlefield Trust's video on the Battle of Shiloh.
250 Union men of Everett Peabody's brigade are up early on patrol. For the past 3 days, their pickets had been exchanging shots with Confederates. Many worry it signaled a pending attack.
So right off the bat, this is an important point because there are certain, I think, misconceptions that people have about the Battle of Shiloh, and one of them is that the Union was caught completely by surprise by the presence of Confederates in the area. That's not entirely true. As they mentioned, Peabody's men had been skirmishing for several days with the Confederates, and it was very early in the morning on the first day of the Battle of Shiloh that Peabody's men once again ran into Confederate troops. They didn't know that an entire main body, an entire army had marched up from Corinth, but they knew Confederates were in that area.
But no one in high command had been convinced. That Sunday morning, within earshot of their camps, they find a monster lurking amidst the Tennessee timber. 9,000 Confederates spearheading a surprise attack. After the next 2 days at Shiloh, our nation would come to realize the true bloody cost of civil war.
And he makes a good point, and I'm sure this will get touched on later on, but Shiloh, when that happened in April of 1862, the Battle of Shiloh was had more casualties than all of America's previous wars put together. I mean, that is how, in hindsight, for us, living in a time where there's been World War II and World War I, these massive wars that cost millions of lives, we don't realize just what a big deal this was in American history, because nothing like this had ever happened before.
By the spring of 1862, the Union's disaster in the East at Bull Run the previous summer seemed a distant memory, thanks to a string of victories in the West. In February, the Army and Navy under Union Brigadier General Ulysses Grant and Flag Officer Andrew Foote had worked together to capture Forts Henry and Donelson.
And this was a big deal because this was pretty unique, at least in the Civil War at that point, the Army and Navy working together. And what made this work is that Grant and Foote both understood the importance of the other and the importance of them working together. Neither one of them was concerned with personal glory. They were concerned with getting the job done. And they understood the best way to get the job done was to work together. Now, what's unique about the way the Army is constructed out in the West is that there were a series of departments, and there were different department heads who answered to someone up from them. It wasn't like in the East where you just had the Army of the Potomac, for example, that operated independently. Grant was a department commander who had control over a certain small area in western Tennessee. And so he had to answer to Henry Halleck, and Halleck just did not want to give him permission, but Grant and Foote kind of over and over again come to Halleck and say, we've got these forts, and these forts are huge for us if we can take them, and we can take them. So Fort Henry was taken almost without a shot being fired. Basically, it wasn't really that well defended, and it wasn't a really significant fort. And so the men from Fort Henry just kind of gave it up and then marched 10 or 15 miles across land over to Fort Donelson that was on the other river. You had the Tennessee River and the Cumberland River here. Donelson was a different story.
Combined with the loss at Mill Springs, Kentucky, General Albert Sidney Johnston, the Western Confederate commander, was forced to move southwest, handing over Kentucky and much of Tennessee, including the crucial supply and industrial center of Nashville. Major General Henry Halleck, commanding the Department of Mississippi, ordered federal forces up the Tennessee River, a major conduit into the heart of the Western Confederacy.
Order them after they practically begged him on their hands and knees to be able to do it.
The Federals embarked in March, using 174 steamboats to ferry almost 40,000 men toward their eventual target, a now bustling junction in northern Mississippi.
And this is just another one of those examples of one of the things that made Grant such a brilliant commander, was his ability to handle logistics well, doing things like coordinating with the Navy to use the boats to get his men down the river, coordinating supply and logistics and all these sorts of things. Now, Grant made some serious mistakes during the Shiloh, the campaign. Really, Shiloh wasn't a campaign. It was a campaign to take Corinth, which they eventually did.
In this day, rivers and rails are the key means to move men and supplies quickly, and Corinth, Mississippi is a crucial southern rail link. It straddles the Mobile and Ohio Railroad and sat on the only line connecting the Atlantic and the Mississippi.
So take a look at this, because what you've got here is not only this rail hub, but also you've got the river right there, the Tennessee River. So this is a really, it can't be overstated how important Corinth was to the Confederacy.
And by mid-March, Grant's army was in position to capture it as they encamped around Pittsburgh Landing. His was a good defensive position. Waterways protected both flanks and their rear, and they were within 20 miles of Corinth. But Halleck, cautious, has ordered Grant to hold until the 30,000 men of Don Carlos Buell's Army of the Ohio arrives from Nashville. On April 2nd, Johnston learns that Buell's approaching column is near Savannah, Tennessee. It is an opportunity to strike his opponents while they are divided.
So here's an important example of the importance of Army intelligence. Johnston knows that Grant's coming for Corinth. It makes sense. It's the logical thing to do. He's preparing for an attack on Corinth. But he gets word that these two large Union forces are divided. And if they merge together, they're going to be an overwhelming force that Johnston can't take on. And so when he finds out that Buell's still several days away from Grant, he sees his opportunity to take the initiative and attack Grant before Buell can merge and their combined forces can march on Corinth. It was a great strategy, but it's one of those situations where strategy is foiled by the weather.
And Johnston seizes it. General P.G.T. Beauregard, the hero of Fort Sumter and Bull Run, plans a very complex attack that attempts to coordinate Johnston's four corps. But rainy weather turns the roads into mush, delaying the attack. Believing surprise is lost, Beauregard urges retreat. Undeterred, Johnston declares, "Gentlemen, we will attack at daylight."
Johnston's one of those few people who was actually a general before the war started. You know, a lot of these generals, folks like Grant, for example, Grant's highest command before the war was captain. You know, a lot of the men who eventually rose to high command in both armies had been lieutenants, captains, things like that. But Johnston had actually been a general in the Army of Texas as far back as the 1830s.
Despite warnings, Union commanders are confident that Johnston's army remains at Corinth. General Grant headquarters across the river at Savannah, and few of the regiments manning what is to become his front lines had ever been in a full-scale battle. Johnston's intent is to turn Grant's left flank away from the lifeline at Pittsburgh Landing. But it's Grant's right that receives the first Confederate attacks as William Hardee's brigades advance on the camps of William Sherman's division. As late as 7 a.m., General Sherman remains unconvinced this is a general attack, until rebel skirmishers from Cleburne's brigade kill his orderly and shoot him in the hand.
That'll convince you.
2 of Cleburne's 6 regiments move around the swamp and get caught in a vicious crossfire. The intense fighting here is just south of a church with a Hebrew name that I...
So, I want to talk about this for a second. In fact, I'm going to back up a little bit because I want to look at that map.
Move around the swamp and get caught in a vicious crossfire.
So one of the things, and I highly recommend anytime you get the opportunity to visit these battlefields, because inevitably, almost every time I've visited a battlefield for the first time, a battlefield that I'm already familiar with what happened there, my perspective of the battle always changes when I actually visit. And that was true at Shiloh. And one of the things that really struck me, well, there were a couple of things at the battlefield at Shiloh, and I mentioned this in my visit there in that video. One of the things is that from the very point that the Confederates first attack all the way up to Pittsburgh Landing, it's uphill. I mean, it is constantly uphill. This area in particular right here, just kind of southeast of Shiloh Church where Sherman's headquarters was, is particularly brutal. There's a stream that runs across there. It goes kind of downhill and then uphill. There's woods. It's very difficult terrain. And the Confederates just had to have been exhausted from attacking and attacking and attacking all day. The other thing that I noticed is that the Shiloh battlefield is covered with a lot of woods, marked by small open areas. And you can kind of see that here on the battlefield where you've got these open cleared fields, but then lots of trees. It had to have made it very difficult to coordinate your army when you're trying to attack.
The intense fighting here is just south of a church with a Hebrew name that ironically meant place of peace, Shiloh. Despite initial resistance, the Union's lines are soon stretched thin. Benjamin Prentiss forms his 6th Division, including 12 guns on the Eastern Corinth Road. His untested ranks wither Gladden's brigade. But around 8:45, Confederate attacks force Prentiss to fall back. Many don't stop until they get to Pittsburgh Landing, leaving empty camps, hot meals, and all their belongings. Hungry.
And one of the men that we talked about earlier, Colonel Peabody, who was in command of the brigade who made the first contact with Confederate troops that early morning, was actually killed in that attack.
Rebels pause to eat and loot. An hour is lost as commanders, including Johnston, struggle to get these men moving again. Amidst the panic, Union defensive lines are patched together with anyone in shouting distance. And casualties and terrain unravel Confederate command structure. By mid-morning, the battle at Shiloh has become a soldier's fight. Alerted by the distant thunder of artillery, Grant departs for Pittsburgh Landing around 7:30.
Yeah, he's like 9 miles away when
He
this
orders
happens.
Bull Nelson's division of Buell's army to begin moving down the river, but Nelson is unable to march until early afternoon. Grant also orders Lew Wallace's 7,500-man division to reinforce his lines.
And my great-great-great-great-grandfather was in Lew Wallace's division in the 20th Ohio. And one of the things that Grant talks a lot about in his autobiography is his frustration with Lew Wallace that day. I mean, they're under this heavy Confederate attack throughout the day. And very early in the battle, Grant sends Lew Wallace a message, sends him multiple messages telling him to come as soon as possible. But there's some confusion, and Wallace gets lost on the roads, and this is something that even 20 some years later, when Grant's writing his memoirs, you can tell he's still just really frustrated by what happened. But Grant, being the ever kind of kind person that he was, and trying to give Wallace the benefit of the doubt in his memoirs, tries to see how Wallace could have maybe not gotten there in time, tries to see that side of things, but really, honestly, there was no excuse for Wallace not to have made it to the battlefield in time to help out.
But a series of errors and delays turn a 2-hour march into 7. Neither will arrive before nightfall. Despite a sprained ankle after arriving at the landing, Grant rides the length of his battle line and rushes men and ammunition to his defenders. But until Wallace and the elements of Buell's army arrive, Grant will fight outnumbered.
Or so you thought.
By 10:30 a.m., the Confederate onslaught starts to overwhelm Grant's right flank. Attacks push Sherman and McClernand back, first to the crossroads of the Purdy and Corinth roads, and then to Jones Field, 1.5 miles from Pittsburgh Landing. Johnston succeeds in bending Grant's line, but in the wrong direction, toward Pittsburgh Landing, where the line can be shorter and stronger.
When you visit the battlefield, if you ever get the chance, Pittsburgh Landing is one of the strongest defensive positions I've seen on a battlefield. To be perfectly honest with you, regardless of the fact that Johnston ends up getting killed during the battle, regardless of anything that had happened at that point, I do not believe the Confederates could have taken Pittsburgh Landing that night.
With the Union right flank in retreat, entire Confederate regiments fall out of line to eat and pillage. This lull allows Sherman and McClernand to regroup and launch a ferocious counterattack. By noon, they've rolled over the unprepared looting Confederates. For the next 3 hours, Sherman and McClernand's determined stand will force Johnston to commit his last reserves and will occupy the entire western 2/3 of the Confederate army. Confederate brigades on Johnston's right make repeated attempts to dislodge Stephen Hurlbut's division from a blooming peach orchard just south of a pond where the dying crawl for a final drink. By 2 o'clock, Hurlbut's line begins to give after Johnston personally rallies his brigades to attack en masse. Johnston had an old dueling wound that kept his right leg numb most of the time.
Yep.
He may not have paid much mind to the mini-ball that severed his artery.
And that dueling wound, I believe, actually had happened while he was a general in the Army of the Republic of Texas. I don't remember the details, but I remember reading it at some point. So let's talk about this bullet for a second, because the bullet hit him in the back of the knee while he was leading this attack. The surgeon who later on viewed the body of General Johnston, and actually removed the bullet, said that it had to have been friendly fire because the particular type of ammunition that had struck Johnston, and it struck him from behind while he was up front leading troops, was only used by Confederate troops in that area of the battlefield. I believe it's generally understood, and if you visit the battlefield, the National Park Service will tell you that's kind of their official position, is that Johnston was killed by friendly fire.
By 2:45, Johnston bleeds to death. He is the highest-ranking officer to be killed during the Civil War. In Grant Center, the division of W.H.L. Wallace and the remnants of Prentice's ranks form a half-mile front and a thick overgrowth along an old wagon cut. 6,200 men and 25 cannon make the names of the places there: the Sunken Road, the Hornet's Nest, synonymous with bloodshed.
The Hornet's Nest is kind of a unique position because, again, when I thought about the Hornet's Nest, I thought about this kind of maybe elevated position that was kind of overlooking the ground. And it's actually like a depression. It's lower than all the surrounding area, and the surrounding area is all open and it's woods. It's kind of an interesting defensive position when you visit it there.
Thousands of Grant's men have retreated in panic. Lew Wallace is missing, and Bull Nelson, Buell's lead element, is an hour out of Savannah. Low on options, Grant orders a new line of defense at the landing. Around 4, Sherman and McClernand, with depleted ranks and no fresh troops, fall back. Confederates pause their attack to get ammunition to the front lines. Sherman and McClernand reform along the heights of a rugged ravine. By 4 p.m., Hurlbut withdraws, forcing Prentice to refuse his left flank. With Grant's right and left flanks in retreat, sounds of heavy fighting in the center draw Confederate brigades like a magnet. W.H.L. Wallace's outnumbered Federals put up a fierce defense from an overgrown thicket. Their intense fire thickens the air with whizzing metal. Rebels call it the Hornet's Nest. Brigadier General Daniel Ruggles pounds the Hornet's Nest with almost 60 cannon.
They call this Ruggles Battery, and you can actually, it's really a cool spot on the battlefield. I visited it, where you can kind of stand there on the road and just see this long line of artillery that's all pointed at the Hornet's Nest.
Largest concentration of artillery on the North American continent up to that time. By 5 p.m., elements of 14 of the 16 Confederate brigades on the field surround the Hornet's Nest. Wallace and Prentice start to withdraw. Then Wallace is shot in the head and left for dead. Over 2,000 men are captured. The day-long Federal stand waged all across the battlefield at such places as the Peach Orchard, Hornet's Nest, and Crossroads staves off total defeat and buys Grant another day to fight.
Yeah, do not underestimate how much the Hornet's Nest meant to Grant being able to form a defense. Because one of the things that was happening was that men were just retreating en masse, and Grant actually starts giving orders that these retreating men should be rounded up and formed into regiments. He said, I don't care what regiments they come from, I don't care what units they were in before, form them into a new unit for the defense. Like he was that adamant about that. This is just one of those moments. Grant was known for really, really calm, cool, collected feelings on the battlefield. Like nothing shook him, nothing rattled him, and he was really good under pressure like this, and that was a perfect example of that.
Fire.
My favorite quote from the entire Civil War. Lick 'em tomorrow, though.
Grant's army has fallen back 2 miles and incurred immense casualties. Heavy cannon fire from the Union timberclads Tyler and Lexington pesters the Confederate lines. Grant's last line on April 6th is formidable. Confederates must cross huge ravines.
Yeah, there's a big ravine over here. There's also, believe it or not, on the battlefield, right over there on that right side, a bunch of pretty significant Indian mounds. So there's actually another kind of national park within a national park there, because the Indian mounds are actually part of a completely separate historic site.
Stalled, the Confederates withdraw to the captured Union camps. Little effort is made to supply ammunition or reform their exhausted ranks. That night, a heavy rain moves in, soaking the living and the dead alike. Beauregard, now in command, believes Grant's reinforcements are not coming and sends a dispatch to Richmond proclaiming complete victory. In fact, the lead divisions of Buell's army had a hand in defending Grant's last line, and Lew Wallace's division finally arrives on the scene about dusk. Though these reinforcements had been spotted by rebel Colonel Nathan Bedford Forrest, no one in Confederate high command took any action.
I don't think it would have mattered.
Handed his greatest setback since the war began, Grant vows to whip 'em at daylight.
Yeah, the actual quote is, you saw the first quote there from Sherman. Sherman says, "Well, Grant, we've had the devil's own day, haven't we?" And Grant looks at him and said, "Yeah, lick 'em tomorrow, though." I love that quote. It's my favorite from the entire Civil War.
By 6 a.m., Grant has 40,000 at the ready, half of which are battle fresh. The weary Confederates number around 28,000. Despite their exhaustion and disorganization, when Grant's army moves to retake the field and drive the rebels back, Beauregard eventually manages a solid defense. Despite his savage counterattacks, he is forced back 2 hours later to a position along the Hamburg-Purdy Road.
So let's talk about this for a second, because, you know, any of the generals in the East in the early part of the war on the Union side probably would have been content to just stay put. Okay, you know what? They've kicked our butts on day one. We got reinforcements. We've got an excellent defensive position. Let's just stay here and let the Confederates come at us. But not Grant. That's not how Grant thinks. Grant wants to win, and he knows the Confederates have to be exhausted from attacking as they did and suffering the casualties they did. He's got fresh troops, and he uses them. Just one more example of the competence of General Grant as a commander.
Ultimately, the Union numbers are too great for Beauregard's depleted ranks. At 2, he pulls back in retreat to Corinth. Grant does not pursue until the next day. Almost 24,000 men are killed, missing, or maimed in just 2 days. Shiloh is the bloodiest battle in American history up to that time. Despite winning Shiloh, Grant is vilified for the shocking losses and near defeat. Many demand his removal from command.
And he was.
President Lincoln refuses, saying, "I can't spare this man. He fights."
Now, technically, he wasn't removed from command, but he was put into a position where he didn't have a command, basically. Halleck came down and personally took charge of the siege of Corinth and almost completely screwed it up. And Grant actually thought about resigning and going home because he felt like, what am I going to do? I'm second fiddle to Halleck. I have no ability to make decisions of my own. He could see that Halleck was already starting to screw things up. And it was actually Sherman who convinced Grant to stick around and to kind of stay it out. And eventually he was able to kind of take his command back, and Halleck was sent back to an office.
In Albert Sidney Johnston, the Confederacy loses a prized leader. No general will fill his void in the Western Theater.
That's true.
Beginning in May with Corinth, the Union Army embarks on a Western mission of conquest. with many more places to fall. Vicksburg, Chattanooga, Atlanta. The battlefield is quiet now, though a new fight is ongoing against the foes of time and progress. Nearly 4,000 acres of land have been preserved, most recently the site of the Fallen Timbers action. Once host to two of the bloodiest days in American history, Shiloh is now one of the best preserved battlefields of the Civil War, a sprawling living monument to the sacrifices made there 150 years ago.
One of the things I love about the Shiloh battlefield is that it's a significant battlefield in terms of size, but it's also not near anything commercial. Antietam's similar to that, but yeah, it's not overrun with hotels and tourist attractions like Gettysburg is, but still has a significant number of monuments. And one of the other cool things about Shiloh is that you still have a lot of the Confederate dead buried in the trenches they were originally buried in, and those are marked where you can visit them. Most of the dead from battlefields were reburied in national cemeteries or in other cemeteries. Not at Shiloh. A lot of those trenches still exist exactly as they were. So let me know your thoughts about Shiloh. Let's have a conversation about that. Please make sure you hit that like button. If you haven't already, subscribe. Check out my video from my visit to the Shiloh battlefield in the link in the description below. We'll see you again soon. Thanks for watching.